All right, so I think I'll just get into it. Rather than go through our long bios, we don't have much time. Jen Wilson's Chief Operating Officer of Army Week Association. Dan and Lenna have both lived in Ukraine for 30 years, both Canadian-Ukrainians. Dan is a lawyer, territorial defense fighter, and this fine woman has just raised $254 million for Ukraine. So, Dan, I just got back from my 6th trip, and the difference in Ukraine from 5th to 6th trips, November to April, was drastic for me. What's happening on the ground now?
Well, thanks, Jen. Look, this is a war of total resistance. I mean, you know, every one of you, if you'd lived in Ukraine, would be involved in it. I mean, people like myself who never held a rifle until January of last year are now serving in the military and in the Territorial Defence Forces or in something else. Volunteers, medics, etc. And you know, we've held off the 2nd largest army in the world, and we are now about to push back. And we can win this war. We are going to win this war. And, you know, even if we have no ammunition, we're going to throw stones at them until we win this war. And, you know, 89% of Ukrainians have said that they do not want to give up 1 inch of territory, even if Putin uses nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And that just goes to show the resilience and the resolve of the Ukrainian people. So anybody who's talking about a negotiated peace and some sort of giving up territory for peace, for one, that's not a peace, that's a pause. It means that he's just going to wait and come back, and he's going to go forward. And so when we come to this notion of a victory and a counteroffensive, I think it's really important to understand this isn't about a Ukrainian victory and a Ukrainian counteroffensive. This is your victory. This is our common victory, because we cannot do this without your help. We need need more long-range missiles. We need the planes. And as President Zelensky says, our freedom is your freedom. Our soldiers are dying every day, so yours don't have to. And if we don't defeat President Putin and the Russian army in Ukraine today, totally defeat them, it means that this will just go on and on. If we leave them in Crimea, it means it's like having an aircraft carrier pointed at the heart of your country. And it means that our economy will never develop. It means Europe will never be at peace. It means Europe will always be wondering, are the Russians going to come after us? And that affects you. Because you allocate capital, you invest, you like stability, you like security, you like to go into markets, especially in Europe and other places in the East and the Middle East, where you can feel comfortable investing. So if we lose and we don't have your support and we don't get the victory, what does China take as a takeaway from that in Taiwan? So the knock-on effect of this is going to be enormous.
I was going to say, what does victory look like? Is it the Koreas and there's a demilitarized zone? Is it Japan and Russia where they didn't technically end anything, but they don't fight anymore? Or is it pure victory for Europe?
I think President Zelensky has been very clear. It's our 1991 borders, territorial sovereignty. It's the total defeat of the Russian army in Ukraine. It's a war crimes tribunal to try the aggressors, and reparations.
So, Lenna, you've incredibly raised $254 million through your fund. Can you talk a little bit about what those monies will be used for?
Thanks, Jen. So first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with everyone today. And as Jen mentioned, I've been 30 years in Ukraine. I'm fortunate to run Horizon Capital with $1.4 billion under management. We've got 25 people out of 35 on the ground in Ukraine, but we have 26,000 people through the companies that we back. So just like many of you who are GPs who manage funds, we're the same. We're based in Kiev. We've been doing this for a long time. We've got LPs with $630 billion in capital behind us, and we decided, you know, of course we did our contingency planning. Of course we took care of safety, security, business models, et cetera. But for us, what's really important is that we don't wait for the war to be over, that we raise this fund now, that we do it at a time when Ukrainians need the capital the most, and that we make history and bring a group of investors together who care about being part of this and part of standing shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine now. So Jen, what do we invest in? I mean, we invest in what we have invested in over the last decade. We're the largest tech investor in the country. Tech is, for Ukraine, not just an industry, it's a currency lifeline. If you look at right now, tech is 45% of service exports. When we started investing, it was a $110 million industry. It's a $7.3 billion industry. It's the only sector that grew last year, 6%. So you've got the combination of tech exports and service exports, plus what Ukrainians working abroad send home, is $2.7 billion a month, more than what Ukraine receives in aid from those few sectors and from Ukrainians working abroad. It's incredible. So we plan to put the money to work now. We're doing our first investment in June, followed very shortly by 2 more. We're not waiting until the war is over. We see the resilience of Ukrainian businesses are incredible. I mean, everybody's heard about the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Everyone is in admiration of what the Ukrainian military has done with the backing of Western allies. I mean, 60 billion of military and security support so far, 30 billion in terms of financial aid to keep the state running. But at the same time, the business community pays the taxes that pay the guys who are on the front lines, and they take that very seriously. The internet never went down. The banking sector never stopped. Your cards never stopped working. Folks showed up to work every single day despite the challenges. And they feel that they're really fighting on the economic and investment front. And the last thing I'll say is that, before we go on, is, you know, we had the pleasure just over 2 weeks ago of bringing our investors to Kiev. I mean, imagine, we brought 12 people signing at our signing ceremony. We intended to raise 250, we raised 254. We had a signing ceremony with the president of Ukraine. 12 of our investors got on a train. Despite airstrikes that morning, they came to Kiev. They went to the president's administration. They spent an hour with President Zelensky, who said to them, "Thank you for your trust. This is the first and a symbolic investment, and it shows that global business and investors believe in Ukraine's victory. Otherwise, you would not be doing this." It was incredible.
I think when I fell in love with the Ukrainian people was I can't remember if it was my first or second trip, but it's 11 p.m. at night, it is dumping snow, and it had just been bombed a few hours before, and we got stuck behind a garbage truck trying to get in because they'd showed up for their shift, and he was just, we're still doing our garbage shift. And I was just like, you can't occupy that kind of pride. No, you just can't. So for those of us that are involved in this fight, victory is but one step on this train. Reconstruction has been estimated it'll take about $500 billion to rebuild Ukraine. Where's that money going to come from, and what's it going to look like? Is it a Marshall Plan? Is it the U.S. doing it?
I mean, you know, it's going to be a lot of different things. We have a lot to rebuild. The critical infrastructure of the country has been really, really seriously damaged. The infrastructure, the roads, the ports, et cetera, have to be rebuilt. This is really going to be on a massive scale. There is a role for the private sector to play in this, and Lenna, probably I'll let her to delve into the weeds on that, but this is going to have to be sovereign-led, super-sovereign, like the EU, as well as IFIs, the international financial institutions, that are going to have to come up with some sort of a package of, especially insurance to take military and political risk off the table. And that makes people in this room a lot more comfortable about whether they're going to allocate money into specific projects or not. Social infrastructure is going to be a big thing. Obviously, that's a public sector area, schools, hospitals, clinics, that kind of stuff. But, you know, you've seen there was actually 76,000 businesses that were registered, new businesses, SMEs, small, medium-sized enterprises, registered last year in the middle of a war. And that's just shows that people in Ukraine are not giving up, and it creates new opportunities. We had the pleasure and the honor to represent Rheinmetall in a transaction that just closed this week. The announcement has just been made. Rheinmetall makes tanks and armored vehicles, and they did a joint venture with, are doing a joint venture with Ukroboronprom, the state-owned defense industries, to build a maintenance, repair, and overhaul sector for the armor that's in the country. And then they're going to manufacture other fun things. And that's unique. We never had a defense industry that allowed the private sector, and especially global players, into the marketplace. This is a game changer. Same thing with energy. We're going to become a laboratory for experimentation of all the things the EU talks about, but is afraid to do because they can't get across NIMBYism in the various member states. Yeah. But we need energy. We need to rebuild that infrastructure. So we're going to look at hydrogen. We're going to look at green energy. We're going to be looking at different ways of oil and gas, different flows. Very importantly, the framework for this is going to be the EU accession process that Ukraine went into. Yep. When I was at Ukraine Invest for 3 years, I was trying to convince investors to invest in the country. My biggest problem was that they couldn't find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine, knew nothing about the place. I think that problem's been solved. The next challenge is the fact that we've actually had regulatory convergence and regulatory compliance for a whole host of areas as through the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement, which was signed in 2015. About 50% of what needs to be closed and completed to accede to the EU is already done. So, we're well on that way.
Yeah, in terms of the reconstruction, my message to everyone is don't wait. Don't wait until the war is over. I'm also chair of American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, chair of the board. We have about 600 members who've invested close to $50 billion in the country. When we do the latest surveys of these members, 100% of them are either continuing their businesses or increasing investment. About a third of them are increasing investment. 15% of them have higher profits in 2022 than any year before that. And none of them are waiting. We have lots of new members. The fastest growing committees are defense, security, energy, infrastructure. Those for whom Ukraine was subscale, very small projects, you're not going to come for a $15 million project or a $50 million project. Now, clearly, post-war, the reconstruction is immense. I'm glad, Jen, you mentioned about Marshall Plan and others. I mean, Marshall Plan at the time was $13 billion. In today's dollars, $115 billion. The reconstruction of Iraq is $220. The reconstruction of Ukraine is estimated at $750 billion. And that's not a number pulled out of the sky. That is 2,500 experts, 24 working groups. That's 40 countries who've already signed up to a 10-year plan that gets Ukraine to 7% growth by 2032. Wow. That's split up into, right now, reconstruction, 60 to 65 billion while the war is ongoing. The World Bank just set up a 14 billion trust fund. 9 billion has already come in. That's already started reconstructing so that folks can return back to their homes. There's critical infrastructure needs. So it's not that it's waiting until the war is over. Already, 60 to 65 billion will be spent now. 14 billion already is in, trust fund and backing these projects. And then looking forward, post-war, 300 billion is the estimated value of the projects, and 400 are new economy projects. Green projects. What Ukraine, you're not rebuilding the crumbling Soviet infrastructure of the past, you're building new housing, energy efficiency, bringing renewables, bringing all kinds of new technologies, clean technologies to Ukraine. So it's certainly my message to investors is do not wait, come now, go to things like the Ukrainian Recovery Conference in London, which is happening in June. I'm speaking at a panel with the Prime Minister at that event. And come see for yourself, because lots of companies are already there. When the war is over, there will be a lineup. Right now, every investor is welcomed. every investor has the time to speak with ministers, to folks in the presidential administration, to parliamentarians, to folks in the Ministry of Infrastructure, on the ground. When it's over, it will be quite overwhelming for them. So that's my message. We see, BlackRock now working with Ukraine in terms of designing a platform for investors to come through. JP Morgan just signed an MOU. We see the German and French governments who have said to their companies that we will guarantee your investment in Ukraine. So a lot of activity is happening right now that folks do not see beyond the media, that think, okay, nothing's happening except
war.
Except war. But what's happening is everyone is getting primed, getting ready. We're investing, others are investing. And
it's funny
I wouldn't wait.
The rebuilding this crumbling Soviet infrastructure. I was there for the Superhumans Center groundbreaking in November, and they're really just overtaking a Soviet hospital. And I was there for the opening in April, and in November, you could see it was my first experience with a Soviet-era hospital. And then going back for the opening, we joked about it, that it was the NATO wing and the Soviet wing, because it was a stark contrast, but literally just side by side.
That's right.
I think that these are really important points, because they go back to what I was saying at the beginning about what victory looks like. If you are seeing our partners, sovereign countries in the West, that were reasonably, let's put it mildly, standoffish about Ukraine in the past because they didn't want to upset the Russians, etc. All of that's now off the table. And there's now, I believe, maybe I want to believe, but I believe that there is now an understanding that Ukraine has to be part of the economic and security architecture of Europe with American involvement, and that Ukraine is the linchpin to, again, the epicenter of global change and security, but it is crucial to have Ukraine to have peace in Europe, and that's economic peace, and that's economic expansion. And the things that Lenna is talking about are absolutely right, that this will be a process driven by our allies that will provide opportunities for the private sector to participate and should offer comfort. One of the big issues, let's deal with the elephant in the room, one of the big issues that always hurt Ukraine, and was certainly something I struggled with when I was head of Ukraine Invest, was the issue of the perception of corruption. And one of the things that I could never get out into the public space was that we had actually set up one of the most robust anti-corruption institutional frameworks anywhere in Europe. The fact that they weren't operating in full tilt at the beginning was a big problem. Now you read in the press that there's been this guy's been arrested.
Supreme Court Justice yesterday.
That guy's been exactly. That actually, from my perspective, shows that the system is working.
Yeah, for sure.
And that we are going to be cleansing ourselves, and that there are consequences for this kind of malfeasance. And this is going to.
I got to add something on that. I got to add something, because I'm all about facts. I love facts. I think they tell a great story. But on the corruption part, imagine all of the anti-corruption institutions. You have the NACP, which is the prevention. You have NABU, which is the investigation, and then you have SOP, which is the prosecution, the High Anti-Corruption Court. All of them now have their heads in place. They have been selected by a panel of 50%, including international allies. Everyone has signed off on these folks. And in March, Ukraine received really something that never happened in 30 plus years of independence. First time ever, the Council of Europe removed Ukraine from the blacklist for corruption, being globally unsatisfactory. 31 recommendations, they've implemented 15, 9 are almost done, and 7 have to be done within the next 9 to 12 months. That's aggressive, but that's what it's going to take for Ukraine to get into EU, which Ukraine desperately wants. So all of that is going to be driven by EU. One last thing that I want to make a point about on the reconstruction is that Ukraine isn't looking for a handout. It's not, our investors are not doing this for a handout. They want to make an impact, but they also want to make a return. When we look at the last 10 years, our funds, all the investments over 10 years, over 30% net IRR. That's what investors expect to come into the country. That's what the new fund is doing, and that's what investors expect. When we look at the sales growth on top line growth, over 30% in 2022, I want to bring one company to life because I think it's just like that resilience. And Jen, going back to what you have gone to all of these frontline cities. And there's a company, it's just amazing when I talk about their, imagine this like higher end discount retailer. Okay, it's not like Dollar General or Dollarama. It's higher end. They had, before the war, they had 863 stores, mainly south and east, mainly in Kramatorsk and all those towns along the front lines. War happens, 636 stores, many of them shuttered, 100 of them destroyed. They're up to 962 stores. They're opening a store every 17 hours. They're expanding so quickly that they're entering Romania shortly. That's what you're seeing on the ground. That doesn't come through
The
when
new
you're
economy.
talking about,
Yeah.
that's right.
New economy.
It doesn't come through when you're talking about,
It's
what
just
the
war.
media is showing.
Yeah.
It's all destruction. It's all, but that business resilience, that strength, how these companies are continuing to deliver good services, what Ukrainians need, and doing it every day, it's just incredible.
Because you're unoccupiable. You just are.
Exactly.
You can't occupy that spirit.
You can't occupy it. You can't occupy 40
And
million people
I
who have that spirit.
I think that's a good way to end it. Thank you so much for both of you. Slava Ukraine.
Героям слава.
Thanks, Jen. And thanks for everything that you do.
Absolutely.